The other side of this discussion is the accommodation. In truth, we can't anticipate everyone's functional limitations. My one complaint about the language of universal design is that there is no such thing as universally accessible. Accommodations are a necessary part of treating each person as an individual. One way to think about accommodations is to recognize that they are not about equal treatment, but equal access. If you find me lying face down in a swimming pool, you might be motivated to drag me out of the water and perform life-saving measures, clearing my lungs and maybe even doing CPR. But you might not do the same for folks who are having an enjoyable round of Marco Polo. Pulling those people out and giving them CPR may be the best way to ensure that you never get invited to pool parties. The same is true for accommodations with students. Creating an accommodation for one student does not mean that we necessarily provide that same accommodation to all students. We could all agree that Sarah may need extended time on an exam to show her professor she knows the material, and that Bob doesn't need that extended time. But in the same way, Sarah's accommodation for extended time on exams is likely not going to be necessary in a course where she has not been asked to take timed exams. One thing Alpha staff think through in making decisions about appropriate accommodations is whether A, a requested accommodation is reasonable, B, whether it represents a fundamental alteration of the service provided, and C, whether the requested accommodation addresses a specific functional limitation. But what's really important here is that the courts have consistently understood this as an iterative process. Institutions that have a set of one-size-fits-all policies are at significant risk when those policies interfere with a student's access. In some instances, faculty have decided that there is a minimal concern of change in the curricula for specific accommodations. We have a long track record of providing extended time for exams to students with learning disabilities. We've agreed as a faculty that this is not a fundamental alteration, and so Alpha will provide these requests without bringing a great deal of discussion from campus partners. On the other hand, we've had a number of students in online programs request an accommodation to turn in assignments late. The faculty determined that this request represents a fundamental alteration of the services our academic programs provide. But that does not mean that Alpha doesn't consider each request individually. It means that if Alpha were to approve this request, it would require the participation of a wider number of campus partners. And my point here is that making decisions about what is an appropriate accommodation is an iterative process. The good news is, Alpha has a long track record of good faith with the faculty in these situations. They will not require us to do something as an accommodation that has not been thoroughly vetted through the appropriate procedure. If, however, we have questions about Alpha's findings about an accommodation, the best practice is to discuss this with Alpha rather than negotiating changes in the accommodation with the student.